Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Victory Never Sleeps. This is a episode we meant to give you this time last month, but due to unforeseen internet outages in Pennsylvania, we were thwarted. But it's an episode I really wanted to do, and it's one that I think is really valuable, and that Witan Erickson here has, I don't know, I think a really important outlook on, and a lot of really good perspective to share with us today. So I really wanted to make sure this happened. Cliff, appreciate you being able to be here with us tonight. Top of the show stuff to let you guys know how things. Okay. Sorry, scattered in my head, trying to get everything remembered to make sure I hit it. 1 week from this Friday. So you got like a week and 2 days until Ostara at Thorshof. Believe all three of us are going to be in attendance there, and I'm excited for that. We would love to see each and every one of you there if you can make it. That's at Thorshof, which is in Linden, North Carolina, and that's March the 21st through the 23rd. It's going to be a fantastic event. We've got amazing people signed up to be there so far. That area are some of our best folk. It is a beautiful, beautiful Hof dedicated to Asatru, and something that love for everybody not only to get to see once, but get to see lots of times. So yeah, if you can make it, please do reach out to any of your folk builders or us here at vns@runestone.org, and we can get you sorted on who you need to talk to or any assistance that you might need to make that happen. Other stuff, top of the show, we are doing amazing on our progress towards paying off Njordshof. Something we spent a lot of time thinking on lately and trying to, push towards, because the end is getting so close in sight. We are, what does that look like? 78.4% of the way there, which is amazing. You guys' generosity is really exceptional. We appreciate it quite a bit. This was a big deal for us. We knew that anywhere that was going to be a state near the coast that was going to fit our needs for Njordshof was going to be a little bit out of the same price range as some of our previous Hofs. Florida is very desirable for a lot of really good reasons. So this one was dig a little bit deeper to make this one happen. And in such a short amount of time, in less than 3 years, you guys have helped us pay this down, like we said, 78.4%. We have 52,815 to go. That's just about $72 per member would get that paid off immediately. And we're pretty excited because we've got big plans and a lot of enthusiasm behind getting Frey's Hof. In order to do that, we have to pay his father's Hof off first. So if anybody wants to contribute, we would appreciate it. And thank you so much to everyone who has contributed so far. If you're listening to this on the podcast format, you can contribute at runestone, runestone.org. You can also apply there. If anybody is hearing this message, if you listen to the show, maybe you're listening for the first time, maybe you're a long-time listener. You are a heterosexual white person that wants to come home to your ancestral gods, we invite you to join us. Link at the same website. Any of our folk builders, any of our leadership up to including Cliff and myself would be very happy to answer any questions you might have or help you with that process if it's something you'd like to do. But we're doing really, truly amazing and groundbreaking things. We're changing lives. We've got a lot of wonderful things ahead of us, and we would love to have you guys be part of it. So if you're not a member, please consider it. Also, wherever you are consuming this, whether you're watching it or whether you're listening to it as a podcast, Please like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. This is, if you find this spiritually impactful, wonderful. If you find it educational, great. Just find it entertaining. That's good too, and we appreciate you. Share it around. There may be one of your friends or family that might really get something out of it. So we appreciate your help that way too. It's a little bit of a scramble to get ready for tonight's broadcast, so forgive me if I get a little bit tongue-tied here at the start. We still have 30th anniversary t-shirts on sale at our website, also at the previous link. They look great. Gothy East's lovely wife, Madison, did the design work on that and did a beautiful job. They're nice quality shirts. If you would like yours, I don't know if we're going to restock or just what we're going to do. So this may be your only opportunity. And we would love to sell you one of these amazing shirts. And we appreciate you. So we got that. It's what I've got for you so far. And there's a lot of, please keep in mind, it's a question-driven program often. So any question you guys have tonight about Asatru, but probably about most anything else, we would be very happy to answer those. It may take us a while to get through them, depending on how big the stat gets, but we will definitely get to them. And if you have a question at any time that you want us to answer on a future edition of the program, please feel free to email vns@runestone.org, and we'll definitely put that, and it will move to the front of the line in the order it's received for the next program. That said, a lot of different places for the conversation to go tonight. I'm pretty excited about it. Cliff, how you doing? How are things in your neck of the woods? And if you can lay the groundwork for us this evening. It would help if you were not muted.
Yep, it would help if I could find the right tab too. Sorry, I was looking around at some stuff. Things are good here. We are starting to see signs of spring. I actually take the kids out and we look for them, hearing the birds chirp and seeing those first flowers that'll probably get killed by frost in the next few weeks as winter reminds us it's not quite spring yet. Getting ready to head down to North Carolina for Ostara in the south at Thorshoff. Very excited for that, to see a lot of my friends and colleagues and our folk. It's exciting. We're it's a good time of year. I really like this time of year. Even though it's not quite there. I work an 8 to 5 job. So having daylight again after I leave the office is nice. I really do like this time of year.
So I suppose, and because I don't think you're the first person to use the term, but you're the one that it really crystallized in a conversation now probably 2 months ago. When you say Asatru is a living religion, what do you mean when you say that?
So, I mean, so I guess it came up. We were in a conversation amongst our Gothar. I forget if it was one of our Gothar calls or one of our Gothi student calls or something like that. But when I talk about Asatru being a living religion, it grows and it changes. I think I remember now we were talking about not being able to name the names of all of the Aesir, that sometimes a Christian or an atheist or anyone who's not Asatru or who's not polytheistic really wouldn't really understand where we're coming from on that. When they're like, well, you can't even name all of your gods. You don't know all of your history, and so on and so forth, where that might be something that they challenge us on, and use that to sort of undermine the legitimacy of our faith. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that not knowing the names of all of the Aesir actually enriches Asatru. And some of it may be because some of their names are lost to time. Maybe our ancestors did know their names, and particular poems weren't recorded in writing in the Poetic Edda, or weren't referred to by Snorri Sturluson in the Prose Edda, or in any of the other sources that we have from all over Europe at different times. I would wager that there's at least one Aesir's name who perhaps has been forgotten over time. But I also mean that there are surely Aesir whose names we never knew, just as the folk, that when the stories that we have about the Aesir are nothing like the complete and unabridged history of all things that have occurred amongst the Aesir. It's the portion of their existence that's been revealed to us through stories that were relayed, sometimes by the gods themselves to our ancestors, in perhaps in visions by our ancestors, by inspiration from our ancestors, and how they related to the world. We know these things that were handed down, but that's not the totality of the Aesir. I think I referred to it at that time as that, we know the names of the nobility amongst the Aesir, the greatest of them. We know their King Odin. We know the name of, Prince Thor, so to speak. We know about the most significant of them amongst themselves, but also as far as our interaction with them. So we may not know the names of all of those that the Aesir consider greatest, if they just never interacted with mankind in a way that's relevant to us. Their names could still be a mystery to us. And the Aesir are a social unit. They are a civilization. So we know that they can die, and we know that we know that they can be born. We know that Modi and Magni, for example, are sons of Thor, which strongly implies that they had a beginning that was after Thor's, right? So if Aesir can come into being and can then cease to be, then it's a dynamic living society, and that would mean that there could be new Aesir that have perhaps come into being in the relatively short time since Snorri recorded the stories, or any other number of things like that. It's not, we don't know everything about the Aesir, and none of these things that I'm saying are necessarily like, I don't know. I mean, it could be that we know all the names of the Aesir. It's maybe they did all reveal themselves to us, but it is entirely possible, and I think much more probable, that they did not, because this, just like all civilizations, there are different strata, and there are different parts of that whole that make it all work. And the things that are recorded in history don't usually have to do with the corner grocer or the farmer who helps the warrior and the ruling class affect the will of that civilization into the world, just as the Aesir affect their will into the cosmos. Sort of a loose analogy that I made is, if someone is English, they may, if they're really knowledgeable about English history, be able to name all of the kings of England, but they could never name all of the English people. That's not a thing, but that is still the reality of what English is, and more than that. So it changes over time. It grows. It's it's organic in the sense that, you know, that it's alive, and that, you know, I sometimes will talk about how, our connection to the Aesir is like we are related to them. We are their kin. We are their descendants, because we're part of a continuous chain reaction of life that has been ongoing and unending and overlapping since, Odin really imbued our folk with life at the beginning of our existence. And that same that same life force that they gave Ash and Elm, Ask and Embla, is like, it never, like, it didn't like start here, stop there, and then start and stop and start and stop again. It's one like river of life that they gave us, and we're all part of that. So that's kind of what I mean. You know, more specific questions will help me flesh some of that out, but that's how I approach it, in that, that it's not monolithic, that it's not something that we should approach as, you know, as carved in stone, as unchanging, as, you know, as cold and as dead. It is very much warm and alive and dynamic.
Well, I think that's really important, and a couple of things. One thing about Asatru that I really respect, but it makes it hard. But I think, as you've said before, and we all know to be true, oftentimes the easy thing is not the right thing. So we're intellectually honest about the things that we know, about the things that we don't know. Anything that our Gothar tell you on this program is absolute. If they say it is true, it is absolutely true to the best of their knowing. And we try to be very honest about things that we think versus things that we know. And I don't think you have that in many other traditions. You have, and I don't like to overly compare, but I think, depending on the audience, comparing and contrasting has its place on here. One thing that is interesting is there's many faiths in the world that had like their period of time where their god or their gods interacted with their ancestors, and there was some kind of an exchange there. And then everything else for perhaps thousands of years is just studying ancient written texts and kind of a one-sided endeavor. And I don't think other faiths would characterize themselves that way, but I think it's kind of true nonetheless. And I think, I don't know, one of the things that makes Asatru so vibrant and so alive is that we believe fundamentally in the ongoing gift cycle between us and between the Aesir. We believe that through that continuation of sincere worship and loyalty, we receive insight, we receive blessings, we receive, countless boons in our life, and that the Aesir guide us and help us in the reforging and continual forging of Asatru. And what that means is, as Cliff said, yes, there's plenty of things that are lost to history. And I think that if any religion is honest, that's probably the case if it's very, very old. But there's also within Asatru a steady revealing process to where, as we build closer and closer relationship with our gods, they reveal more and more of themselves, their personality, their will to us, and fill in gaps in a way that perhaps our ancestors knew that we don't know or didn't know. Make no mistake, we we know the gods that we focus our worship to, and we know the goddesses that we focus our worship to. But the point about not knowing the totality of any level of divinity is certainly our ancestors had local deities, or less less all-encompassing deities that were deities of tribes or of regions, of rivers, of places. To say that we honestly can factor all of those in from the dawn of our race until the conversion period, and spanning all of the lands that our ancestors conquered and immigrated to and moved through, would be preposterous. But that's one of the things that, as Cliff said, makes things special, is we have a living relationship with our gods and goddesses. We seek to know them and build from our increased knowledge and our increased relationship. And over time, we get to know them better. And we get to learn more and grow in our faith. And as a result, the Asatru Folk Assembly grows in our practice and grows in ideally ever more perfect ways of knowing, worshiping, and honoring our gods. And that's really kind of a special thing. I've said on here before a number of times, and I believe it to be true, our gods are connected to us. We are connected to our gods. The more we know and the more we learn from a variety of things, the better. But if we had to start fresh, if somehow all that knowledge was lost, the Aesir still exist, and we still exist. And through good faith exchanging of gifts and giving of worship and loyalty to the Aesir, we would get to know them anew as a people. We would get to learn their stories and know them over time and rebuild, the corpus of material that we have, because they live, they exist. We live, we exist. Therefore, we can interact. A lot of really well-meaning people get stuck in a research phase about Asatru and neglect practice and neglect very simple but heartfelt worship and gift exchange. And I think that misses the richness and the, for lack of a better term, the realness of what we do. Before I get much further, I want to acknowledge G.W. Farnsworth, consistent donor on the program. We appreciate you so much. Donated $30 to the VNS Fund. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. And your generosity is an example to us all. So I'm looking over on the side of some of our questions. I think what we'll do, because it can go a lot of ways, is try to tie some of these things back into our main theme as we go through them. But our first question tonight is from Sierra, wonderful folk builder, Sierra Chapman in California. Good evening. I hope you men are well. What is a blot fair, and why is it important? Why should I strive to do it? Cliff, would you like to answer that?
Sure. Speaking of Asatru as a living and dynamic religion, the blot fair is something that we have only recently given a name to, although I think that the core concept of it has existed for longer than that. And correct me if I'm wrong now, Gothi, this is something that's relatively new, even amongst our conversations in the Gothar. So I may not have the full technical refined meaning of it down, but as I understand it, it is a journey of faith, much like a pilgrimage, making a journey to our Hofs, for example. And as I understand it, the name blot Fairth actually has something in common with the word Fairth has a root connection to like the fair in farewell, like journey well, and that it is an act of worship to make the effort to go to a Hof or to a national event. It's all of what we put into, it's not just the physical journey. It is all of the effort and expense and planning that's required to make that happen, to get yourself and to get our folk collected into a place where we can hold, a high blot, as it were, at one of our Hofs or our national events. How close am I? How much did I miss?
No, you're good. I'm checking right now to see if it was ever used that way historically. And I don't think that it was. I think maybe if it was, it's happenstance, but I'd have to check. But basically, it's a blot journey, a journey to do blot in our ancestors' time. There's a number of occasions of it. I think that the most well known is the 9 years apart journey to do sacrifice at Uppsala. They would have to travel great distances often to go to a religious gathering or to go to a Hof and do worship. And so the process of preparing your things, going on the journey, gathering with your folk, perhaps in a distant place, spending time in that, in contemplation, in worship, in celebration, was a real testament to your faith, to the significance that you placed in your belief in the Aesir and your faith that they would look kindly upon the gift of that effort that you put forth. And so in a modern sense, this kind of popped up organically amongst the membership. We have members that, so Cliff and I, being leaders, have had the honor of going to great many of our national events over the years, and more specifically of being able to go to all of our Hofs. Anyone who's just tuning in, we have our first Hof was established in 2015, Odin's Hof in Brownsville, California, followed in 2020 by Thor's Hof in Linden, North Carolina, and Baldur's Hof in Murdoch, Minnesota, and then in 2022 by Njord's Hof in White Springs, Florida. So we've been able to go to all 4 of our Hofs, and many people haven't. And so a lot of our members are very excited, and over time, as they're able, as life permits, to plan trips to go worship these gods in their Hofs, the first of their kind in well over 1,000 years. And that's a really special thing. And we've had we had a California member recently travel all the way across the country on a massive road trip to go to all of the different Hofs and then to Sigerheim in Tennessee, all in one big trip to see them all. And it was a really special thing for him. We have members all the time that maybe they'll do one Hof at a time. Some of them will have a road trip and they'll go to a couple of them. And it's a really nice thing, and it's a beautiful thing to see our folk be able to do. And for those of us who've been doing this for a long time, I think it's kind of an amazing thing that I don't think, I don't think people were necessarily even thinking about that being a reality for our folk. I mean, 15 years ago or more, that seemed like a very distant thing. We're like, man, one day if we can just get one off, that'll be life changing. And the fact that in such a short time we now have four and soon to be five when we end up getting phrase off, and I think that's going to be closer than people think. But yeah, going on those journeys, everyone I know who's made the effort to go out to one of our Hoffs has, many have found it life changing. Everyone has benefited from the experience, and so many people have been shaken to their core in a very good way by the experience. And it's so beautiful to watch our children play in the courtyards of Hoffs dedicated to our gods. That was the dream of so many people for so long, and to live in a time where that dream has become reality is a real blessing in and of itself.
It's interesting. You mentioned the once every 9-year journey that our ancestors would have made to Uppsala, and that is probably the highest one, at least the highest one that we know of that our ancestors did. But I think that also, in order to travel to any Hoff, for their, for Midsummer, for example, our ancestors would have had to have done some significant traveling, even if it was just in their petty kingdom, which would be like a county that we have today. That still might have been a day or two's travel for them to go to their most local Hof, and to leave the farm behind and to make that journey was not a small undertaking. That would have required planning, that would have required expense and effort. So, for many of us, we're fortunate and able to, to travel to a Hof that's local in the same state as we are, or, to have a blot group, or, other gathering we can get to, in the same day and go home and sleep in our own bed, all in the same journey. And that was the exception for our folk, I think, that they would have had to travel at least a day or two to make it to any Hof. And I think it's a good thing for us to exercise that discipline and that sacrifice.
Absolutely. So we have a couple of questions from Twitch. Appreciate our Twitch audience. It's good to hear from you guys. Any place that you're watching this, feel free to ask questions. We'd love to get all of those on here. Bubblegum Man. How come so many self-identified Norse pagans on TikTok are really aesthetically negative, like fat and colored hair and stuff? You know what I mean. Yes, we do know what you mean. Cliff, do you want to take a swing at that?
Sure. First, I will state that I am not a self-identified Norse pagan. I am an Asatru. There's a big difference, and some of the things that Bubblegum Man describes are I think maybe central to that, or at least they're symptomatic of it. I think that for a lot of people out there in general, they will look at finding a religion that is not currently mainstream as their form of rebelling against the mainstream culture. It's a very counterculture thing to do. So for them, being a self-identified Norse pagan is not much different from being a wigger into hip hop, or being a punker. It depends on what decade you're in. What would have been the thing that would have made your dad most pissed off? But that's kind of what they're trying to do. They're trying to distinguish themselves from a previous generation because they are trying to assert some sort of cultural independence from what they were brought up as, whatever that might be. A lot of times it's Christianity, although more and more we're finding that is more of an atheistic secularism that people are being brought up in. And I think that that's an unhealthy thing to do on the whole, although a lot of us have to go through that phase in order to, be able to come to sincere belief in the Aesir. I mean, I had a phase where I, was into different occult things and didn't really connect with them, and went through a period of atheism where I thought I knew everything because the universe, man, right? And I think that's what some of them are doing. And I think that a lot of the other things that you see, I mean, all right, so being fat, that's just because they're lazy. They're not actually applying the proper self-discipline in their life. That is true almost across the board. It's very rare that somebody has some kind of condition that causes them to be that way, that's out of their control. Things like colored hair, I carve out a special exception for like teenagers who are supposed to biologically be sort of in that trying to assert their independence mode, where they're in that final stage of becoming an adult. And for anyone who's a parent, we know that ultimately what we're trying to do is to make our children not need us, right? Like, they're supposed to be able to feed themselves and survive when we're gone. Like, that's the most basic sort of primordial goal of raising a child. So teenagers who do some of these rebellious things, I think it's a natural thing, as long as it's a phase. For people that get to be into their early to mid 20s and are still, exhibiting teenage rebellion, I think that's where it can start to be problematic. And that the more distance you get from that being the natural phase in your life, the less healthy and less complementary that it is to someone. I think that a lot of it is it's common in American culture or in Western European culture that this persists well into adulthood when it should not. And it doesn't have to exist in teenage years. It just I'm a lot more understanding of it there, because they're still trying to find out who they are. They're not grown-ups yet, so it's a different standard. But I think that it shares a common root with other symptoms of being unwell that we see in our people, things like alcoholism or other addictive tendencies across the board. I think that it is it's a way of acting out, a way of getting attention, which is negative. It's like the kid who will break a toy rather than clean it up because it gets them more attention, that kind of a thing. That's my take on it. It has nothing to do with religion, that's for sure.
Yeah, so those people are gross. And I just want to put that out there. Those people are yucky. Cliff's opening volley, I think, bears repeating. I wish that we could, completely control all of the branding of who claims to be what. The world doesn't work like that. A lot of people can claim to be whatever they are. One of the things that is very nice, we have worked very hard for many, many years to have certain level of ownership and integrity in the term Asatru and what it means. I would never and have never described myself as Norse pagan. The people that typically describe themselves as Norse, and this is not monolithic, there's people out there that genuinely don't know, don't come to it with the same associations the rest of us have. And yes, the language of our paganism comes from the Norse. We are in fact pagans. It's not wrong. But it's why it's so important to me. Everybody wants to call what they do something different. We're Odinists. We're heathen. We're this, we're that. All of those things on their own aren't wrong and aren't incorrect. But it's really confusing, and it mixes your association with a lot of unsavory things, like the people that you were identifying on TikTok. But no, we are Asatru, and we don't do that. Now, like any other group of people come to us with a varying degree of health or unhealth, and it's really important to bring all our folk home. We got fat people in the AFA, and we actively try to help them be healthy. And, if they're willing to, we want to support them every step of the way and encourage our people to be healthy. We've got people with colored hair in the AFA, a lot of them with natural colors that are quite beautiful. A lot of, some of them with more exotic choices that I wouldn't advise them to make. But I think the commonality in the person that we're all picturing by your question is that rebellion, angsty, try to be edgy thing. And aside from just being disparaging to it, there is a phenomenon that I think Cliff touched on that children go through a phase of. But in the world that we live in recent decades, more and more adult people don't get out of that perhaps social adolescence until later in their life and spend a lot of time reacting against. So, oh, well, normal, well-adjusted people in my country are Christians, so I'm not going to be a Christian. I'm going to be a pagan. I'm not a pagan for any paganism's sake in a lot of ways. Very often they're that to be the anti-Christian, or, they dress up particularly edgy to be anti-normalcy or anti, whatever social constraint they feel is there. And they're defining a lot of their stuff by either a desire not to or an inability to fit in socially with their friends and their family and the world around them. And it displays itself in a lot of ways, but I think the most common one we see is the grossly unhealthy and like just championing degeneracy thing. And we see that phenomenon a lot. To be honest, a lot of our people are lost. They don't know what to do. They feel let down by a lot of, quote unquote, traditional authority around them. They don't see their place in the world, and it metastasizes in some really unhealthy life choices and some visually unappealing trends. And I think that's what you see. But you had another question following this. Do you agree with Oswald Spengler's idea that Christianity set the stage for cultural Marxism and progressivism? Cliff.
So I'm not familiar with Oswald Spengler's, but I mean, given the length of its history and reach, I think Christianity set the stage for a great deal of things in the modern world. Not all of them bad, by the way. It's certainly, the certain aspects of it certainly could be, considered globalist and communistic in the sense that, it is a universal religion that in its own text explicitly says to go and to, preach the gospel to the four corners of the earth. It does talk about giving the shirt off of your back to those in need. There's a lot of ideas like that, which not all of them are bad. I mean, giving to people who need things, people that are worse off than you, is not necessarily bad. It's all in context, and I would say there's a lot about who are you giving to. And supporting your own family, I think, should be obvious, but not everyone does it, so it's not always. Supporting your own people, it should be obvious. I think that in other aspects, Christianity helped to protect Europe in a way. I was. In some ways, I wonder sometimes if Christianity or something like it was not part of Odin's overall plan to have our folk ready for things that were to come. Our folk tend to be disunited and tribalist. Referring back to the previous question about how everyone has, a special name for what they do. I knew some guys that referred to themselves as folkish, tribal, independent heathens. They couldn't just say Asatru. They had to come up with this thing, and it sounded silly to everyone but them. But that's, that sort of, the questions are connected in a way, because I think that independent streak in our folk has not always served us well. We have a real hard time at uniting against the common foe. And I think that in the history of Europe, that for all of its faults, I think that Christianity served as a bulwark against Islam, that I don't know that the tribal society under Asatru would have. A unified Asatru people would have been able to withstand that, but that wasn't the reality that existed at that time. But I mean, at its core, Christianity is globalist, and is, it's, I guess the short answer is yes, but I don't know that the things like cultural Marxism or progressivism would not have occurred without it, which I guess means the short answer is no. It's complicated.
Yes, I absolutely believe that Christianity is the root of both of those things. But like Cliff said, I have no idea if they would have, reared their ugly head in a different form or a different way if that hadn't been the medium that was there. But I think it was specifically well suited because the teachings of Jesus, certainly as recorded in the Gospels, are that way. They are a specific appeal to the underclass in a Roman Judea that was downtrodden. The Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount is a lot about blessed are the losers. And I don't mean that in a like pejorative, but the people who are losing at life, those who suffer, the meek, those who are downtrodden. It's a celebration of victimhood and a promise that one day their God would flip the scales and that the greatest will be made least and the least be made greatest. That upheaval is literally the promise of social Marxism and the current that we still see recently very disturbingly with progressivism. And it runs very counter to Asatru and, the faith of many people who are not, I was going to say monotheistic, but I don't even mean that. I just specifically mean Christian. This was covered and kind of downplayed quite a bit because in order to convert Europe, among other places, there had to be an appeal to the warrior elite and to the winners and to the victorious. And you ended up with some very odd depiction of like mighty warlord Jesus and his warrior thanes in his battle retinue to sell that to the princes and kings of Europe. But over time, and the more authentically Christian European Christianity became, the more that undercurrent of, as you say, cultural Marxism and progressivism took hold. And I think it was a slow rot to our folk soul. And I think that's two-pronged. I think the information, the values, the messaging was toxic and a poison to our folk that took centuries to fully manifest. But I also think that's doubled by the severing of our troth with the Aesir. By breaking our bonds and our ancestors betraying and turning their backs on our gods, not only did they have this horrible influence from something toxic, but they didn't have the safe haven, the protection, and the strength that comes through standing loyal to the Aesir. And that double hit has caused the immense soul sickness that produces the TikTok fatties that you talked about earlier as just one of those symptoms.
I want to disagree on a small detail, I think. I don't think it's so much Christianity as it is the lack of Asatru that set the stage for cultural Marxism and progressivism. I think that Buddhism, for example, would have had a very similar negative effect on our people if it had been that. Because there's this core of world rejecting worldview that's in there, and that that this glorification of being impoverished in this life, for example, that is, I think, kind of at the root of what you were talking about there, Shagothi, Matt. I think it's the same. I don't know that it's Christianity specifically, because I agree that Christianity, it's basically a deception on our folk, and that the only people who really have any business being Christians would be like Jews for Jesus, because that's who the Messiah was for. But that I think we see things in the East, maybe this is more pure Marxism, but I think that it leads to these things even if they haven't gotten there yet. In Vietnam or in China, for example, where they have very Marxist societies that I think could be headed that way if taken to their logical conclusions, and that they had relatively minimal Christian influences, but there were influences by other world rejecting religions and faiths that maybe had the same effect on them that Christianity has had on us.
Yeah, and that's why I was mentioning the dual thing. It happened to take the form of Christianity, but as Cliff said, if it was Buddhism, it would have been very similar. And I think that it matches really well with tonight's theme, talking about Asatru as a living faith. One of the implications of that is that our faith is played out here in our lives as a significant part of existence and something that the Aesir are concerned with, and not just a distant afterlife that's unconnected. It is literally something that we are participating in an active and meaningful way during this life. And there are, rewards and benefits and blessings for that in this life. So many other faiths, so many other universal faiths are world rejecting in the way that Cliff described, in the way that I mentioned earlier about Christianity. There is a narrative that the world is bad, that the world is suffering, and modern Hinduism shares a lot of that as well. Whereas I don't think that Vedic Hinduism did in the same way. Just this idea that life is terrible and something to be escaped or something to be avoided or cloistered away from, or whatever that might mean. In Asatru, we want our people to be actively engaged in life, actively engaged in the world, in the events and the things of their time that matter, constantly a force of nobility and of good in the world and the time that they live in. Their sagas are played out in the world and not in an afterlife. And this is part of something I've mentioned too as a very important contrast in Christianity, and perhaps in other faiths as well. There's an emphasis on salvation, and salvation through the benevolence of a higher power, disconnected in part, or in Christianity's case, wholly from your own worth and value. In Asatru, we don't have a concept of you need to be saved, but you are elevated and blessed and celebrated in proportion to your deeds and to your accomplishments. Your victories matter. Your actions matter. It's not throwing all of that at the feet of a perhaps merciful, perhaps not deity. It's winning respect and making the Aesir proud of you and making them proud to acknowledge you as one of theirs. And that's a real fundamental difference, but I think it factors a lot into the nature of Asatru being a living faith. We're forging our relationship daily with our gods through our deeds and through active things on our part. So, what do we got next? All right, next one is from Rachel, and I believe Svan answered a lot of it in the chat room, but I think for our listeners, it's a good question. If we do not know for certain all the names of the Aesir, how do we recognize them as such? We celebrate Nerthus and Ostara, but are they Aesir? Is Prekta or Frau Hola? What determines belonging to that specific pantheon? And to clear up a couple of things for a second, you just mentioned names. Those names indicate existence, and that gives us something to go on. What I think is more of the point isn't how many things that we might not have. It's allowing for the possibility and the near certainty that some of those names are lost to time, and perhaps some of those names are yet to come into existence. We know the Aesir that we are devoted to worship towards. Now, as Fawn was talking about in the chat room, we also include the Ausvenir and the Himmelwärter, the heavenly wardens. So the Ausvenir are the loved ones of the gods, ones that have, through marriage and through relationship, given their loyalty to the Aesir and become part of the Aesir compound. And when we talk about the Aesir, in its broadest sense, it extends to godly beings within our cosmic order of things. And that extends a little bit beyond the core tribe of the Aesir. We know them as they reveal themselves to us, be it through archaeological understanding, be it through being blessed by insight. And as we develop and forge those relationships, we build those kind of bonds. It's one of the reasons we pay particular emphasis to the Gylfaginning, because it lists there very clearly, at least at the time of its writing, the gods and goddesses that were good for us to worship, the Aesir and the Asinur that were good for us to worship. And it lists Allfather Odin, Thor, Balder, Freyr, Njordr, Bragi, Heimdallr, Uller, Forseti, Vauli, and Vidar. And also it lists the great goddesses of our folk, Lady Freya and Mother Frigg, along with Frigg's handmaidens who serve her and are in her court. So we do know quite a bit of them, and those are where we're focusing our worship. And then we learn and build relationship with the others as they make themselves known to us. And we're always in that process of wanting to make sure we give proper worship to our gods and our goddesses. especially those that perhaps have been forgotten. And the other thing to consider, and we in our Gothar spend time on contemplating this too, our faith is expressed by a lot of different related cultures within Europe over the span of thousands of years, and matching up linguistic differences to see where overlap is really important too. Do you have anything to add on that, Cliff?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to specify that when I was speaking about this earlier, I was definitely referring to the Aesir in the broader sense of the deities and entities that are aligned with the cosmic order of the Aesir that was set by Odin. So that would include a lot of the gods and goddesses that maybe were localized. It would include all of the Vanir who were unified with the Aesir after the Aesir-Vanir War and the exchanging of hostages. And like Ashur Matt talked about, and what was a really important in some of the initial points I was making when talking about how we can't even name all of our gods, is that, so we don't really understand cosmic time or mythic time, the way, the time scale on which our gods and goddesses operate. And we know that it's cyclic, but that they probably don't exist in the same time that we do. But Thor, like to use the Thor's sons example, right? So Magni and Modi are the sons of Thor. So to my understanding as a human, as a Gothi of the Aesir, of the Asatru Folk Assembly, that makes them of the same type of being as Thor. Maybe not as great as Thor yet, but over time, whatever that means to the gods, the idea would be, as a parent, that Thor would be nurturing them to ideally be greater than he currently is, to continue ascension, whatever that means to a deity like Thor. And then that, by implication, I think means that that Magni and Modi would have that same capability one day, and that for we humans, that the pious approach is to understand that if Magni or Modi had their Aesir man-making, we would not necessarily be notified of that, and that if they took a bride, we would not necessarily be notified of that. And that if they then had a son, and then therefore Thor had a grandchild, we would not be notified about that necessarily. And so that there's a continuing stream of life that our gods and goddesses have. We certainly believe that they are capable of creating life. They are divine after all. So I think that leaves open the possibility that there could be new Aesir created that we simply are unaware of yet, which is where we talk about revelation, the revelation of the Aesir to us. Not only can we learn about our gods by meditation and by study, and so perhaps we gain some insight into Odin or Thor that we didn't have before. Sometimes that's called unverified personal gnosis, which is just for an individual, until maybe many people have the same unverified personal gnosis, and it becomes a more a more widespread type of revelation from the Aesir. And that's sort of the point of what I was driving at is that we don't know what we don't know. And I think it would be inappropriate and very prideful for us to not account for the possibility that the Aesir, in the broad sense, are more than what we know. And that and to discount the possibility of them growing beyond the ones that we do know.
Just thinking on that. Before we move on, I'd like to acknowledge Tyler M. Hall bought us a coffee. Thank you so much, Tyler. That is a $5 donation to the Asatru Folk Assembly. Thank you. We appreciate your generosity. Appreciate all of you that donate. If you want to do the buy us a coffee thing, it's in the description of this this broadcast. So the next question up is, Matt, why is that Jotun painted alongside Thor in the Hoff depicted as a swarthy foreigner when many of the Aesir have significant Jotun heritage? Shouldn't Jotunar be depicted by the AFA as white? So Svan corrected this or spoke on this in the chat room. But for those of you listening, I want to rephrase paraphrase what Svan said, and maybe add a little bit on that. So if you look, he's not a different ethnicity, like a different race of people. He's not like a black guy or something. The Jotun in that particular depiction is displaying, and you see this a lot in lore and in epic poetry. Nobility comes through in physical characteristic as well. A person, often a hero, one of the gods, will be particularly bright and particularly gleaming their skin with bright, brilliant hair and piercing blue eyes and a nobleness of bearing, of hue, and that extends the entire image, the entire hammer of that being. And villains, quite the opposite. Even if they're white guys, they're dark and they're brooding and they have a darkness about them. They have an ashen hue to their skin as opposed to the gleaming skin of Asatru in this. They have a different bearing, displaying less brilliant, less highly prized, less noble appearance. And as we mentioned in a previous episode, but so folks realize, one of the interesting and unique things about Asatru is our soul complex. It's not just that there is the body and separate from that is your soul. Within Asatru, your soul, that which makes you, is made up of many different components. One of them is the hammer, or the visual effect that you project from your being. And also one of those is the leak, or the physical body, literally your physical body that you inhabit. And that's reflected too in the art. But if you look at the art, it's clearly, a white guy. He's just not as white as the gleaming white Asatru. But also it was modeled after a particular white person as the model of it. So it was never conceived of as being like a human of a different race, but more to point out the darkness and the negativity of that Jotun soul, in contrast to the bright, noble bravery of Asatru in the picture. Nick asks, what are the keys to working within the structure of Living Ásatrú? How do we best incorporate it into our lives and advance it forward? Cliff, what would you say to that?
daily devotion, I think, is important. And I don't just mean making daily offerings to your ancestors and to the gods. And I don't just mean having a meditative practice. I mean that you need to be Asatru all the time. So you need to share that with yourself first and foremost. You need to make sure that you are honest with yourself all the time, which is, probably an impossible task, but you got to try. You need to, see our natural world and our man-made world for what it is. There's both good and bad in it, and there are truths built into the world that we can recognize to inform ourselves spiritually. I think that it's important that we connect with our folk on a regular basis. If you're fortunate like I, and your family, my wife and my children are also true, that you make that part of your daily going ons in some way. As I mentioned, that doesn't necessarily have to be that there's an offering every day or that there's a meditation every day, although those things are good. If you can do that, certainly do. But that, in speaking with my children in particular, I try to relate everything back to our folk and to Asatru in some way. I talked in the very beginning about, the signs of spring. I really try to encourage my children to see, the joy in the world that we get. And, when it comes time for fall, we'll be looking for things like that, because we're always excited about the season that's yet to come. Right. But to encourage them to, and this is something we should do ourselves. I oftentimes talk about it in things I encourage my children to do, but these are all good things for me to do and for you to do as well. To embrace the world as good and as a place that can teach us about truth, and to make sure that we are not personally separated from it. Take care of yourself physically, take care of yourself mentally, take care of the world around you physically and spiritually. If you're able to go and clean up a park, do that. If you are able to have a garden or a hobby farm, do that. If you are a hunter or a fisherman, or whatever other kind of outdoors activity, do that. I'd encourage you to build something. That could be anything. It could be a tradition in your family. It could be, a structure on your property. Again, things such as, gardening or farming or art. All of these things are ways to not only make Asatru real for you, but to make Asatru real for those around you, because those of our folk who observe you or who know you will see the things that you're doing, and will, hopefully ask you about them, which gives you the invitation to tell them why you do the things that you do and why you think certain things are important. Why do you think that removing trash from a park is important? And it's because we're blessed with this beautiful world that the God's made for us. So, we should care for it. Why do you take care of yourself physically? Because you were blessed with that. And if you don't take care of it, then you won't be able to exert your will into the world and, do your part to help the Aesir in whatever small measure you're able to in maintaining order in the cosmos, in the universe. The little part we can affect, it matters in the long run. And it matters to other people. And I think it matters to our ancestors and to our gods, because, cumulatively, all these little things, they build up a lot. And I think that's one of the reasons the Asatru Folk Assembly has been so successful, because it is something that, starting with founder McNallen and Alshir Gothi Flavel and so many others along the way and currently and in the future have, brick by brick, mile by mile, put together. And any one of those people would have had less of an impact than all of us together. And some of the impact those people make would have been, greater than others, but it all stacks up, and it's really important. And talk to the gods and talk to your ancestors. Be respectful. It's going to be a different conversation with a deity than it would be with your ancestors. Your tone should be a little different. With your ancestors, you probably know the tone to take. With the Aesir, piety and respect, I think, is always good advice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, Nick, your question is a good question. It's also a exponentially broad question because there's lots of right ways to do it. There's also lots of wrong ways to do it. Kind of starting where Cliff left off and working my way back, piety is always a great default option. When in doubt, be truthful and pious. If you rely on piety and honesty, that is a really good default setting when you're approaching being Asatru, when you're approaching interacting with the gods, with the ancestors. Keeping those things as hallmarks in how you live your life will do you well. Part of living Asatru is, again, and I think it's worth reiterating for all of us to be reminded, but also for first-time listeners. Asatru, yes, it means belief in the Aesir if you look it up. But if you look up the etymology, that belief is based on the concept of troth, of trusting in, of putting your faith in and being true and loyal to. And that is a reciprocal thing. It means true to or loyal to the Aesir. And that is an action. It's not a passive setting. It's something that you do every day by choosing to stand with them. Something I would say is develop a mindset to where you base your decision making in part upon that troth. When in doubt, when in question, will an action be in line with that loyalty to the Aesir? As I mentioned earlier, the Aesir want to be proud of us. We honor them by being great. We honor them by excelling. They are better honored by heroes than by villains or by those that are not accomplished. We honor them by making the very best of ourselves. And a big part of that is when you wear a hammer, when you're Asatru, and that defines who you are their representative here in Midgard. You are the person that people see. Just like it pains Cliff and I, even though we have no kinship to the fat, strange-haired TikTok, quote-unquote, Norse pagan, they're putting themselves out there at that is damaging to the overall fame of us, our faith, and the Aesir themselves. We want to glorify them, and we best do that by when people see pictures of us and say, those guys are Asatru, does that elevate the Aesir and our ancestors, or is it a cause for them to be ashamed? considering that not just in our appearance, but in how we act. You are Asatru when you interact with your neighbors. You're Asatru when you interact with your spouse, when you interact with your children. You're Asatru when you interact with your coworkers. Does that interaction bring glory to the Aesir and our ancestors, or does it make them cringe, or does it bring them shame? Living your life that way matters. Another thing that I think is extremely important is considering legacy in the next generation. There is among some Asatru that I have known in my time doing this, there is a feeling like, no, we're just going to stay in this, backyard group, and it's good enough for me and my 4 buddies, and that's all there is. And bully for you that it's good enough for you and your 4 buddies. Is it good enough for the Aesir? Are you building something that will be greater and better for our children and them to practice Asatru? I believe an obligation that we have living Asatru is to move this forward to where the next generation, when you say Asatru, people don't say, huh. People know what that means. And they know what that means in a good way. For us to have more hofs and places for our children to gather and play under the watchful eye of the Aesir, and to grow into men and women, fathers and mothers in that place, giving worship throughout their lives to our gods. That's done when we live intentionally to provide that and pass that down to those who come after us. I think we also do that by remembering and honoring our heroes and those who've come before us, making sure that their name is spoken with reverence and with praise and with celebration in years to come. Remembering and telling the tale is a big part of our obligation in living Asatru. I think some of the next part comes in Nick's follow-up question. He says, how does that look different for the member as a layman versus those in Gothic ordinance? Cliff, what are your thoughts that way?
Well, the biggest responsibility that is given to our Gothar is the maintenance of the gift cycle between the gods and the folk, with capital G and capital F. We have a sacred responsibility to bring the troth and to bring the gifts, the sacrifices of the folk to the Aesir, and to accept whatever blessings the Aesir see fit to bestow on us that they find us worthy of, and to bring those back to the folk. There are other responsibilities that we have that are very important. Presiding over Sumbul is one of them. Conducting the threshold rites, the rites of initiation, such as a man or a woman making, the naming of a child, the marriage of a man and a woman, and the funeral of someone who's passed on are all very important. But the maintenance of the gift cycle and blot is the highest of them. If we had to choose one and could only do one, it would have to be maintaining the gift cycle, because without that, the rest of it breaks down. There are other responsibilities outside of holy rites that are very important that our Gothar do. Counseling of our members in any way that they need, whether that's some kind of marriage counseling or grief counseling, or anytime our folk find that they need really someone to listen to is mostly what it comes down to. But sometimes it's advice, sometimes it's guidance, sometimes it's being told what they don't want to hear. For a layperson, I think that is, for a layperson, it really is about being truthful to yourself, and being truthful to others that you encounter. And that may take forms that we don't always think about. For example, and I may make some people angry on this one, I got to say at least one thing every time I'm on that might make some of our people angry. But if you have children, it is important to actively teach them Asatru. If it's good enough for you, it's good enough for them. I've met people over time, not recently. So if you think it's you, it's probably not. But reflect on it if you feel called out. There are people who will say things where like, well, I'm going to raise my child to kind of determine what's true on their own, and I want them to be Asatru if they find that it works for them, but if they find something else, then I'm okay with that. You shouldn't be. If you teach them to read, you're not just like, well, I'm going to see if my kid wants to read, and if they don't, that's cool too. No, that's dumb and wrong. And we should absolutely teach our children what is correct, what is the correct religion for them. We should teach them we should teach them the Eddas. We should teach them as much as we can about Asatru and about how to practice Asatru, and about how, frankly, to be better Asatruers than we in our generation can be. So I don't subscribe to we should indoctrinate them. Indoctrinate is just another word for teach. It's not a bad thing as long as what you're teaching is good. So that's the basis of cultural memory and of tradition and of many things, in particular religion. So that's something the layperson should absolutely do. If they don't have children, or in addition to their children, they should do the same things for members of their family. It's different when you're talking to someone who is your peer or your elder, but again, if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for them. If they are your family or your folk and you consider them a friend and you care about their well-being, then you should show them why Asatru is healthy for them. And a lot of that, like I talked about before, is in the example that you set for them. Being happy with your life and doing constructive and productive things on a daily basis is a big part of that, because lecturing doesn't always work, right? But when you have those opportunities to actively talk about Asatru, which doesn't always mean that they're the ones who brought it up. Sometimes you're allowed to bring it up. When someone says Merry Christmas to you and you say Yuletide greetings back and they give you a funny look, you can continue with that conversation about why, you got to keep the Yule and Yuletide. It's okay to do that. You got to have some tact. You don't want to be a bore about it. You got to, you want to win, success, victory, right? But so your strategy needs to be important, but don't be afraid of that sort of thing. And I gave this advice to a young man who had his man making at Njordshof just last month at Charming of the Plow. If you ever aren't sure what the right decision is, it's the hard one. I think a lot of people kind of will fret and say, like, I don't know what to do. And I don't believe them. I think it's really that they're afraid of doing the right thing and they're trying to talk themselves out of it. And they want someone to give them an excuse. They're going to come to you and be like, I don't know what to do. How about the easy thing? And they want you to say, yeah, do the easy thing, man. And that's not good for them. It's very rarely that the easier thing is the right thing, because we're afraid of doing right a lot of times, I think, because there are consequences for it. So yeah, act truthfully. Don't act out of fear, act out of courage, and be an active example to our folk of what we already know is right for them.
So that's again, I'm gonna go from where he left off and kind of backtrack on my response answers or whatever. All of our virtues and values only take substance with with consequence or the potential of consequence. When it's easy, okay, so this may not seem like it relates, but it does. Bear with me. We have mutated the concept of good men in society a lot. And it's been mentioned by a number of different people in recent years. And I think it's really important to reiterate that's kind of oh, he's a good guy. Is he, though? When we say that, you're a good guy, quote unquote, good guy, if you're not mean, if you don't like hurt people, if you're nice and easy to get along with. If that's your coping mechanism because you are feeble and do not possess any character and you're just easy to get along with whoever, dude that breaks in your house, dude that wants to steal your wife from you, dude that, wants to hurt your children, you being nice and easygoing and like that doesn't make you a good man. Your kindness in a situation where you don't have another option or you will get destroyed, that's not virtuous. When it becomes virtuous is when you have the ability to mete out great violence on people who cross you and you choose to be nice and you choose to be kind and you choose to do things when there's consequence, where there's things at stake. If you go along with the flow and it's politically popular or socially popular for you to hold a view or a position, and then the second it changes, your positions and deeply held values change with the new political or social wind, that's not virtuous. It's easy to hold the same values as everybody else around you with no consequence. It's difficult to take an unpopular stance because you know it's the right stance. It's difficult to be the one person who stands up for what they know is right when you are the one who everyone looks at funny, or you are the one that possibly bears scrutiny from your peers. Those things are important, that we do the right thing, even if we're the only ones doing it, and that we show that example to our children and to our brothers and sisters that may be flagging in their courage, that we show an example of courage and an example of honor and dignity to our peers for them to learn from. I'm really glad that Cliff mentioned our duty as parents, because that goes into the legacy thing I spoke about, but from a different direction in a way. It is your job as a parent to instruct your children in the things that you believe are good for them and right. If you abdicate that responsibility, that is wrong. Sure, let them pick what sport they like. Let them pick what flavor of ice cream they prefer. Those things are of no consequence. But your choice in religion, your choice in core values of the things that make you who you are, it's a parent's job to instill those in their children. That's should go without saying, but it has become unpopular to say so. Um, please keep that in mind. And, you know, husbands, it's your job to show spiritual leadership in your family and to bring your family to trough with the Aesir and to provide Asatru parents and an Asatru environment to raise your Asatru children, to give you one day Asatru grandchildren and move this forward. That's the job of any person with sincere conviction, is to share and build their household around that and pass that into the future. And those are things that should go without saying, but in today's world, they often don't. But back to Nick's question, he asked how these things look different from a layman to a Gothi. And as a layman, you should do lots of these things. As a Gothi, you are specifically, you have taken on the mantle voluntarily that you are going to do these things. And the weight is on you because you have risen to a higher level of trough with the Aesir, and more is expected of you. As a Gothi, these things are each individually your job to do and to provide. And if you don't, you are accountable for your lack of doing them. As Cliff mentioned, that fundamental is the gift cycle, but it takes a lot of forms. Certainly it takes blot, but it also takes any kind of devotional worship between folk and their gods. And the core of Aryan priesthood is being a bridge between man and the divine, and between divine and the congregants. As Gothar, it is our job to convey the blessings and the teachings and the wisdom of the Aesir to our folk. And it is our job to facilitate the exchange of gifts between our folk and the Aesir, and to maintain that eternally. That must and need be done. As Gothar, it's also the responsibility to build, nourish, and shape the institutions that push Asatru into the future and provide it for our following generations through work in preserving our history, in building our AFA membership, in building and managing the Hofs of the Asatru Folk Assembly, of consulting on and, depending on your position, developing the positions and the doctrine of the Asatru Folk Assembly moving forward. Those things are fundamentally important, and this ties back in with the idea of Asatru as a living faith. Our Gothar build what it means to be Asatru and what that looks like. We build and craft Asatru to maximum relevance in the world that we find ourselves in. And we refine that always. It is our job to make that the best it can be and to incorporate new revelation, new understanding, and new wisdom, newly attained wisdom into that process. So Asatru 10 years from now is better, more refined, closer to being worthy of our gods than it is today. I will give you the very best of what I have for the remainder of my lifetime to make the Asatru Folk Assembly the best and most pleasing to the Aesir that I possibly know how to. But I sincerely hope that when I look back beyond the veil 100 years from now, the Asatru Folk Assembly has made great strides and become even better than the best that I can provide. And hopefully that always advances. It's our job to make those advancements as Gothar. Next question we have. I've heard a lot of new terms today. Is there a document laying out all the AFA theological terms? No, a great deal of them are laid out in the Asatru Trulagbau, which is at runestone.org, and you can download that there and read it. That is our most fundamental statement of what we as a church believe, and that has a great deal of the terminology explained in it. There's not a standalone document like deciphering terms, but any member of AFA leadership, any folk builder, any Gothar would be very happy to clear up anything that might be confusing to you. And I'd encourage you to ask any of us anything at any time, and we'd be really happy to clear any of that up.
It's a good idea, though. We should put it on the project list.
We should. Nick, could you mark that down for us, please? We have something proto of that internally that we've worked on. Finn Wraith. Oh, welcome, Finn. It's good to see you. He asks, does it ever happen that someone's children grew up in Asatru and decided they don't believe in Asatru? Cliff.
Sadly, yes. I can think of specific examples of that. I can't name them here. Of course, that wouldn't be appropriate, but that is a real thing, and it is sad. I think that's the thing about raising children. We can do everything we can to feed them properly, to teach them to exercise, to give them a good education, both in letters and in runes, as it were. We can teach them everything that we need to prepare them for the world, but ultimately they are going to make their own decisions when they leave the nest, and we may or may not approve of all those decisions. And the other thing I think is important to keep in mind is they have a whole lifetime, however many days that may be. They don't know the answer to that, but just because those situations have unfolded doesn't mean that they will never be Asatru. But yeah, I can think of more than one example of that having happened.
Yeah, I think that happens in any faith. As Cliff mentioned, just because someone drifts away doesn't mean they don't return home. One of the really important things, I think, when we're talking about raising children, building their childhood full of positive associations and touchstones with your faith, so that it's something they look back on fondly and that they see as their home, as a base to come back to. We talked earlier in the show, it's funny how a lot of these things come full circle, but when talking about fatty blue-haired TikTok Norse pagan, whatever, people go through a period of rebellion, and we see it a lot with children where they want to strike out on their own and they reject what their parents do. Not all children do that either, but some, and there's a tendency to want to separate from their parents and figure out their life on their own terms to a degree. I think there's a lot to be done to where that doesn't equal a complete separation, but more a natural growing and going out on your own. But when you give them those positive touchstones to come back to, it makes it it's a port in the storm when they go out there on their own and the grass doesn't look greener on the other side, for them to have a place to return to, that they remember the things that were so valuable about what they had. And sometimes they need that separation to really get what they lost. We see that with adults who have a crisis of faith and break with Asatru and return to Christianity or whatever they might do, we see a lot of those people come back because they realize the grass isn't greener. But one thing that's beautiful about Asatru today, as opposed to in the past, and as I mentioned in the previous comment, this is a constant refinement and process of doing this better. The early generation of Asatru didn't do such a great job of incorporating their children. A lot of that founding generation of modern Asatru was a lot of young men, and it was a lot of guys that didn't proactively involve their families and their children in this that we do. And a lot of them today very much regret not making that more of a part of the practice in that day. And in the last 10, 15 years in the Asatru Folk Assembly, we have seen this beautiful surge of women and children and families coming to the Asatru Folk Assembly and also being forged within the Asatru Folk Assembly. Cliff's family and my family are both really, really special examples of that. So another question, what are the Himmelwärter? That means heavenly warden. Those are the gods and goddesses that are associated with turning of the seasons and with, bigger cosmic elements of our existence. Dellinger, Not, Suna, or Sol, Mani, Deir, and Ostara being the ones of note. There's a lot of gods in our cosmology that exist outside of the very human relationship that we see the Aesir in, that exist in more of a cosmic and a bit more of a distant sense. And that's an example of those. And we list those because it's worthy and good to worship and to honor them, but they're not quite the same or in the exact same way as the 12 Aesir and the two Alsinur I mentioned earlier are. And then Matt and Cliff, do you have morning rituals or prayers? Do you do anything special for Woden's Day, Wednesday? Cliff.
So no and no. I'm much more of a get up and go to work kind of person in the morning, where most of my ritual activity focuses is in the evening with my family around supper time. That's when we're all together, and when we would, bless our meal together, when we would give an offering to any hero who may have a day of remembrance that day, or to the land whites, or to our house white, or it's dynamic, it's living, but that's where we would do that sort of thing. Although I've always wanted to have more of a specific morning ritual, I would require more discipline in my daily routine to do that at this point. It's not to say that I shouldn't. And for Woden's Day, Wednesday, no, not in particular. I'll leave it at that. No.
So, yeah, there's morning people and there's evening people, and I'm with Cliff. I don't know for different reasons or the same or whatnot, but most of my prayer time, when it's done on my own, is done in the evening. And there's plenty of times to do ritual. coming up and celebrating Ostara, that's usually something that's done best during the day, or even better at the dawn on the equinox. But I find my mind best suited for that in the evening. Something about, like, I'm fully there, I'm fully awake, I'm fully present, and you know, dark with candles and stuff is a nice atmosphere for me to really get in the right headspace to do that. And it's also, I mean, it depends on your life or what you deal with. Um, my wife wakes up early in the mornings, and my daughter, so she ends up going to bed before I do. And my daughter wakes me up super early and is, go, go, go the second we get up. So at night is the time I have with stillness in my house for me personally, just as me, not with my family, to do any kind of personal prayer or devotional work. But I do that a lot, and there's not a lot of song and dance to it. I'll light some incense. Maybe I will pour a libation and light some candles and come before the altar and pray. And it depends on what the occasion is. Sometimes it's to celebrate something. Sometimes very often it's to ask for guidance and for wisdom. It's to check in and assure them that I'm doing my very best and ask their wisdom and their guidance so that I can get my job as a Gothi right and do things in a way that they approve of. I also try to make sure I'm thankful for good things that happen to myself or my family and the Asatru Folk Assembly. Other times I'll come before the altar and reach out to one of my ancestors if I want their guidance on something particular, or if it's a special time to remember them, or just if I miss them and I want to reach out. So that's what I do. But again, it's in the evenings. I don't do anything special on Wednesday. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's a really neat kind of immediate association thing to find days of the week that specifically and overtly correspond to our gods and worship them specifically on those days. That's awesome. That's wonderful if that's what you do. That's just never been my thing. I reach out to gods individually as the moment calls for, or as the need or the situation warrants. Many times, multiple gods and goddesses at the same, during the same session of approaching the ice seer and approaching my altar. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy. If you have something more fancy that you do, that's great. What I think, and I'll go back to what we said earlier, the default of piety and honesty are so very fundamental. There's a lot of cool stuff you can probably do that might be very impressive to the gods. I mean, maybe if you have a special poem, or if you have a special song that you do, or any number of things that you do, and that's great. Fundamentally, though, in order for it to be of value, in my understanding, the piety and the honesty and opening of your heart. So piety, honesty, and openness. If you go before your altar and you're just saying stuff because you're supposed to, maybe that's a good step for your very first step. But quickly after that, and for you to get any result, you have to open yourself to be receiving of, their part of the gift cycle. So when you go before your altar, speak honestly and be open to what happens. Don't be full of expectation or demand of what happens, but be open, be receptive, be honest, and be pious. And I think the rest will evolve from there in a good way. Um, I got a couple of more questions coming in. So there's a two-parter. On the topic of living Asatru, can you touch on the importance of practicing Asatru in a very experiential way rather than taking too much from a scholarly approach to Asatru, which makes it into a head game rather than something that is experienced? Absolutely. Cliff, do you want to start with that?
This question is what this entire episode is about, right?
Yes.
So first, I want to emphasize that knowing your runes, studying our lore, all of the book learning that you can do about Asatru is very important. But you can be Asatru without any of that. If you, like Ashur Gothi Matt talked about, if all of that had been lost, if we didn't know any runes and we didn't know any poems, and you woke up out of like a cryogenic chamber 3,000 years from now and there was nothing, your internal spirituality, if you were truthful with yourself about who you are and what you experience in the world, would lead you to Asatru. It would look very different than what we do today in the 21st century, which of course looks very different from what our ancestors did 10,000 years ago. But there's some commonalities. The underlying ethics, I think, would take very much the same shape. Some of that's contextual. So, certain things would likely be different, but the core things that matter, I think, would really manifest because they're inside us. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier about, being open to observing the natural world and even the man-made world, and the parts of it that are good and the parts of it that I don't want to say bad. I think I said bad earlier. That's not quite right, but that maybe seem cruel or harsh might be a better way to put it. That there are predators and prey, right? That all life feeds on other life. These things are just true. And being open to that, taking the time to reflect on the importance of small events, something that people talk about in many faiths, frankly, but in Asatru in particular is omens or signs. Those certainly fall into the unverified personal gnosis category that I talked about earlier. But the fact that one observes them at a time when it matters and that they have some significance to you personally in a moment when maybe you needed to see a sign like that, whether it was affirming or dissuading, whatever it might be. Be open to those sorts of things, and also have a humility about it. Don't expect everyone you tell about it to take it as seriously as you did. You may see something that changes the course of your entire life, and the person you tell about it is going to just say, well, that just looked like some bird poop on a leaf to me. And that's okay. It wasn't meant for them. It was meant for you. I think in a more, I guess, a more common way, or when you are participating in bloat, or when you are speaking to your ancestors, or when you are meditating, or anything like that, any sort of devotional practice that you can engage in, to go into it with little expectation. Not that you go into it without faith and without piety, just that you go into it with a humbleness that it's the right way to say this, that what you need out of that is not necessarily what you think you need out of it. So, not every time that you stand in bloat, not every time that you make an offering to your ancestors is there going to be some immediate makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up kind of experience. And that's perfectly normal. Al-Shagothi Matt talked about how when you are at your altar, don't just say words because you think you're supposed to. But don't not say them because you don't know what you're supposed to say either. I think that going through devotional practice over time can help to build up that relationship. It's like charging up something. Sometimes we talk about charging up a sacred space, and that happens over a period of time sometimes. When we establish a new Hof, we dedicate it and we mark it apart from the mundane world, and that sets it apart. But from personal experience, I know that process continues as the temple stands, and as it's used, its power becomes greater because of the energy of the Gothar who have made bloat on behalf of the folk there, because of the folk who have been there, because of every child named there, every wedding that's been held there. These places and other items can really manifest and become imbued with a power that's real, and be open to that kind of thing. I mean, even hearing myself, I before I was Asatru, I tended to be quite a cynic and, very kind of empirical. And some of what I'm saying even still sounds a little hokey to me sometimes. But it's real. And I know it's real because I've allowed myself to be open to it, even if I may, have a skeptical nature at heart. I think also that not discounting the things that other people say, share stories with other Asatru folk. Be open to things that people say that maybe, you don't have to believe what they say necessarily, but it's important to recognize that they believe it. If somebody says that they had a dream where Thor came to them and told them something, you don't have to believe that's literally true. You can believe that was just a dream. But recognizing that they believe it, and being constructive with them about it may lead you down paths that you didn't expect to go. I would don't make assumptions, make observations. I think that is a good way to go in a lot of things.
So what Cliff said on all of those things, I think, were really good points. I think I'm gonna I could parrot all of those. I think the openness is really important. It's also important to, okay, a couple of things that relate to the question and some that may not, but I think are good to say. When you come to Asatru, you should be very cautious of allowing preconceptions to determine your practice of our faith. Our gods don't expect or want you to be stupid. They don't want you to be irrational or gullible or foolish. And so you having skepticism of things sometimes, there's a place for that. But there's also I believe, a requirement to do this right, that you have an openness, as Cliff said. Maybe it's just a dream, but there needs to be a part in your head that says, but I'm open to it not being. Maybe it was genuinely Thor communicating. And when your mind closes off possibility, that's when you start really distancing yourself from the divine. You don't need to believe everybody's story about everything. In fact, you shouldn't. A lot of them are liars or lunatics. There's also a lot of very sober, very well-reasoned, serious people that have profound experience in their life that they want to share. And maybe the way that we communicate those things, I learned this. I learned this bouncing. Again, it seems like a strange deviation, but it's relevant. When we'd get new guys, when you would report an incident to the police, because you didn't, in that industry, you interact with the police often, how you characterize things makes the entire difference between the bad guy going to jail or you going to jail. Even if the facts are exactly the same, the way you characterize an experience makes all of the difference. And I say going to jail, maybe in a trial process, that's different, but going away and getting arrested, that depends on what you say and how you say it and what those words mean. Because again, you can completely honestly communicate the exact same circumstance. Depending on your word choice, makes all of the difference. So sometimes you have a circumstance. One second. So sometimes you'll have a circumstance to where people will express their spiritual occurrence in ways that you might find very grandiose or silly. Maybe that's just the words they have to describe it. Because I think when we're trying to describe something that is outside of our normal experience, we all grasp the best way to present it. And sometimes if somebody is very enthusiastic because they just had something beautiful happen to them, they may express it in a way that seems unhinged to you or seems grandiose. Maybe you would say it in a more cautious way. Maybe you would present the same experience in a much more measured way. Doesn't mean anybody's lying. It just means some people express that different. But back to how to do this in a experiential way and not to be, cheated out of your experience by never progressing beyond the scholastic. I think what really needs to be emphasized most is directionality. Our gods have zero obligation to conform to your reading list or the stuff that some scholar somewhere has posited about the way the gods work. That's not how this works. The gods work the way the gods work, and everything else is us trying to better understand that or build a better connection. Oftentimes, people, and I don't think they do this intentionally, but they project the gods as that which they read about in their source material and the things that they've studied, and they project that into a picture of what the gods are supposed to be because some scholar somewhere said so. And that doesn't lead to a sincere faith. If you don't believe your gods are real and that they exist and have agency, and then approach the understanding of them to be just that, you reaching up to the gods rather than trying to make them conform to a book you read, then your whole being is oriented in a much better place to understand and grow in Asatru. I've used this analogy before, but our faith is about building relationship through interaction. It's not just about study. Study should bring you closer and help you to do the rest better. But as Cliff said, you can have zero study and be Asatru in an authentic way. You can't have zero interaction and be Asatru. It's the difference between the dude who's never played sports that is memorized all the stats of football and sits in his chair at home complaining about all the plays on TV, and the guy that's actually out there playing football, or the military historian that's been a professor all his life and never been in the military lecturing you about Napoleon and Napoleon. The two things are really, really different. You can be a scholar on Old Norse religious practice or on the sociology of Germanic paganism. That does not make you Asatru. You can be none of those things and just one of our folk who decided to reach up towards the heavens and say, I'm here, I'm listening, here, I bring you an offering, hail Odin. One of those people is practicing Asatru. The other is eminently knowledgeable, but isn't Asatru. And it's a real big difference. And I'm going at you with all these different little analogies, but I think they're meaningful. You can go on the internet and run credit reports and background checks, and you can dig through my wife's garbage, and you can do all these things. I can know none of those things, but I'm still married to her and she's still my wife, and you're a creepy stalker. Those are similar things. You can learn about Asatru all you want, but until you go before the gods and make an offering and reach out, you haven't practiced the religion. And if you are going before the altar and reaching out, you are more Asatru than the greatest scholar of any of this subject matter as a scholar. Please keep that in mind, that scholasticism is a tool to better understand and bring us closer to the gods. It should never be an impediment to appreciating the glory and the agency that our gods have. And that gets misunderstood a lot, I think.
I think it's really important too. Most of the books that people will recommend about Asatru, especially primary sources, were not written by Asatru. They are by and large literary or scholastic works. Sometimes they're archaeological works, but that does not mean they do not have value. But it's important to keep in mind that the Prosetta, for example, was not a religious document when it was written. We're fortunate to have it. We get a lot from that, but that it was written down by a Christian, and that sometimes we need to read it as such. So that's something I think that is important to remember about most of the scholarly works. We're fortunate that that is becoming less the case, as people like our founder Stephen McNown put out works that are actually about Asatru by an Asatruer, but a lot of the stuff, and this includes modern stuff too, are not really so much Asatru books as they are books about something that is Asatru.
Absolutely. Okay, that leads right into the next question. If you're new to all this, where do you start? Cliff, what do you suggest?
All right. So if you haven't already, the first thing that you do is that you go to runestone.org and you fill out a membership application, and we get you hooked up with a local folk builder, because you're going to want to meet other folk. That should be your number one priority as a new person. Getting engaged with the folk, finding out, what their story is. How did you find Asatru is one of my most fun conversations to have with new and old members alike, because the stories are usually something that are really meaningful to the people sharing them, and they're not all the same. It's easy to come into this thinking like everyone went through the same process that you did to get here, but they didn't. People are coming in from all different vectors, depending on what their life story is, what generation they are, and so on. From there, I would read our founder's book, Asatru, Native European Spirituality. It's really important. It'll lay out a lot of the basic beliefs that we have, and how many of them are directly applicable to your life and your practice. As far as stories or lore about our gods, not everyone will agree with this, and that's fine, but I usually recommend that you start with the children's books, not because that they are perfect or all-encompassing, but because they are easily digestible. The biggest thing that for some of the books I'll recommend here is that when you read them, make sure that you change the tense in your own mind. A lot of them are written in the past tense. Read them in the present tense instead. But if you don't know the names of our gods, and you don't know any of the stories of them, and you don't want to feel like an idiot when you're in a room with other people who do, I recommend starting with Delaire's Book of Norse Myths. It's literally a children's book with big, beautiful pictures in it that will help you understand what's being talked about. And that'll get you to where you have some basic understanding of who the different gods are and how they kind of relate to each other. Another good one.
Rip out the last page.
Rip out the last page. Yeah. Understand that these are not books that were written by Asatru. And yeah, I literally do not read that one to my kids. They don't know it exists. And I do, when I read it to them as like a bedtime story, I change the tense as I'm reading it. It's not Thor was, it's Thor is. I mostly catch myself. I haven't, every once in a while I'll slip and read what's actually on the page. But it's a good one to get, a basic understanding. Padraig Cullum's The Children of Odin is another good one to get an easily digestible form of our stories. And these are both retellings of the Eddas. They're not the Eddas themselves, but I would suggest the Eddas aren't the Eddas themselves either, because they're all retellings of oral traditions that predated them. After that, I would move on to the Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson. It's the younger of the two Eddas. It's called the Younger Edda sometimes, but it is written in relatively plain English, which makes it easier to understand. And then after that, and I would read all of it as much as you can. And then when you are ready, go into the Poetic Edda, which is significantly harder to understand, even in the most friendly of translations. So having that frame of reference, that kind of knowledge base from the other tellings of the Eddas will help you in that. It'll make a lot more sense in context than out of context. But most important is the first thing I said, submit an application to the AFA and join, or send an email in to your nearest folk builder or Gothi or Githia and get involved in person. That will go farther than the rest of anything I said after that.
Everything Cliff said with the addition, I dipped out for a second because I needed to go and kiss my daughter goodnight, so I may have missed it. But I think that the Asatru True Lug Mall is a really important thing for you to check out first. I would say even before anything else, because and again, it is not perfect, but with a lot of help from our Gothar, I did the very best I could to lay out the fundamentals of our beliefs in a way that would be accessible to someone who was familiar with Asatru, but also someone who was completely fresh and wasn't. And because I put it together with that purpose in mind, I think it's well suited to give you kind of a foundation to work from. But yes, as soon as you can, get involved with real people doing this in real life. I'm not sure where you are located, but if you are in the United States, chances are you are close to where you can get together with real Asatru doing this. And that is the most healthy, best way to get started. Also, we have members in 11 different countries. I think 11 in addition to the United States. So we could find you someone depending on where you're at. But joining and being part, that is much closer to how our ancestors did this. I get it. I love to read. I love history. I love those things. So when I first came home to Asatru, I wanted to just jump right in and read all the books and do that too. But our ancestors didn't do that. They learned Asatru from their elders, from the Gothar, from the people in their community who were already practicing our faith, and it was passed down that way. It wasn't go do research or go do study. Now, do all of those things, please. And Cliff's thing about starting with children's books sounds silly, but if you genuinely have no other familiarity, do that. This is funny, and until Cliff brought this up, I don't really bring this up as part of my origin story. But before I became Asatru, when I had very little familiarity, I was in high school. The Delaire's book is meant for like little kids. I got it in high school to read and look at. I remember to this day, I can't remember, I think I was a sophomore or a junior, and I got it in high school because it did. It had all the pictures. It's beautifully illustrated. And, I don't consider that my first Asatru book because I read it far before I became Asatru. But that was my introduction. So yeah, it's not a bad idea at all. There's a lot of good things that any of us can help direct you to if you get further in what you're doing. But like I said, the Trulermo, and if it's something, and this is something to think about too, guys, for joining. Our standard for you joining isn't that you are a diehard 100% loyal to the IC or Asatru that day. That's a relationship that's built over time. Our standard is that that's something you want to pursue, and joining is your first step towards that. So you don't need to be 1,000% committed to everything the day you join, but you do need to be open and desirous of that at the end of your journey. So please keep that in mind. Don't let that be a hindrance from you taking that step and joining. Because in order, again, like I said earlier, that's not the most convenient thing, but it is the right thing and the true thing. For you to build that deeply sincere faith, you need opportunity provided to you where that can happen. Joining with your folk and being there in blot and being actively involved in that process, that's the best way and the way that we can be most helpful to facilitate that experience and help you get there. So do keep that in mind.
Something I want to add real quick. So yeah, the Delaire's book, it's like the picture book of saints for Asatru. And I think that, most Christians remember those early childhood books, like the picture book of saints, way more than they do some, that's it. They remember that way more than they do some, some prayer study or something from when they were older. The other thing that I wanted to mention real quick about Pros Edda is, don't skip the Skaldskaparmál, because it's a little tough to get through, but there's a lot in there that will benefit you when you get into the Poetic Edda. So read the Gylfaginning, read Skaldskaparmál, and there's a lot. The whole list of kennings in there is really important for understanding what the heck the Poetica is talking about in a lot of places.
It's good that you mentioned that. I want to say, if you read all of it, the best answer is all. But if you're prioritizing and there's only one that you can do, and keep in mind the Eddas aren't set up sequentially. So they're a collection of lore, a collection of poetry about our ancestral faith, but they're each kind of individual. So it's not like you need to read each of the poems in succession. If you could only read one, I would say read the Gylfaginning. If you could read two, the Gylfaginning and the Völuspá. If you could read two, the Gylfaginning and the Hávamál, and if you could read three, the Gylfaginning and the Hávamál and Völuspá. I say that. Other people may have different choices they put on there, and I think there's probably merit to all of it. But I think the Gylfaginning gives you a really good orientation about the broad scope of it, and it's kind of written with that purpose in mind. So I think that's a very accessible one to start with, that tells you this is this and that's that, and this is here and this is there, and it gives you that orientation in a really direct way. Our next thing, I feel like I'm missing a question. Okay, that's why, because I'm on the wrong tab. All right. Have you had dreams of the gods, or do you know people who have had dreams of the gods, or things like near-death experiences? Cliff.
Oh man, my dreams we don't want to get into. That is like Scramble City there. In all seriousness, I don't remember in particular if I have had, a dream of a god where like a god or goddess spoke to me, or even like featured as like the central theme of the dream. If a lot of my dreams don't have a central theme, but I have had quite a few dreams that are about Asatru and my folk. I don't know that those are revelations as much as they're, kind of a function of the fact that my life is so deeply invested in Asatru, so that it's only natural that I would have dreams about Asatru and the people that I know through Asatru, just like, one might have dreams about work, or, going back to one's grade school, or any of those things that are, so deeply embedded in our minds. I have heard, as a Gothi, I certainly have heard people talk about having dreams of the gods. And like I was talking about earlier, I don't necessarily literally believe that they had that dream, but I always take them at face value. It's not really my judgment on that that's important, whether or not they, had a god or a goddess speak to them or provide some revelation in that dream. It's more about helping them understand what it means to them. Because whether it came from inside of them or was something that was communicated from outside, that's the most important part, is that they understand it and are able to have something productive and constructive come of it. As far as I think the second part was about near-death experiences. So I come from a very Catholic background and family. And so in my family, there were all sorts of sort of like spooky stories. My grandmother and my mom and a lot of the aunts, it seems that it was always the females who talked about this stuff. My grandfather and the uncles and stuff really didn't. It was much more down to earth kind of stuff with them. They were very devout, but it wasn't spirits with them. But I've had lots of stories in my family about like visitations or apparitions. Being a Catholic family, a lot of times it was, oh, so and so saw the Virgin Mary or something like that. I personally haven't had any of those, but and I don't disbelieve the things that my family members said, although I do think that perhaps they misinterpreted them. Just because some kind of female spirit with a glowing aura appears to you and tells you to do something. I don't think they necessarily correctly identify the identity of that entity. But that's, again, just like in the other scenario, that's not really for me to judge. That's something that, observationally, like I was talking about earlier, that's something that, even though I had a skeptical attitude for a good chunk of my younger years, that I think helped open me to the idea of spirits or supernatural sort of things being a part of human existence in this world.
Yeah, so to answer your question, there is this murky area of dreams, as Cliff kind of mentioned. What is legitimate revelation from the gods and what is just a dream. It's really a cool sign in your life. And people talk about this about languages. Like, you really know you've mastered language when you start dreaming in a different language. It's nice when your touchstones in your dreams are fully integrated, incorporated Asatru, to where that is the context of your dreamscape. That speaks a lot to your interior as a person and how much that's become a part of you. I've had the gods in many, many dreams that I've had, but of note, there's a difference, because a lot of my dreams are really fleeting. Like, they're really cool, and I wake up and like, this dream's amazing. Then an hour later, I will have lost it. It's very hard for me to remember my dreams, except for a couple really important ones that I can remember clear as day decades later. One of those involved Lady Freya, and one of those involved the Allfather. those are both really significant to me, and I do think that messages were given to me that were important in those. I've had a handful of other really profound experiences in waking time, but you asked about dreams. Um, Near death experiences. I've never experienced that, but I do know people who have. One really specific who, usually is often a frequent audience member of this program, had a very visceral near death experience that led him to Asatru. And that's really inspirational. And if he comes on here, I may prompt him to share that with the chat room. What do you think about books about people's modern experiences with the gods, Cliff?
Well, I think that sounds good. Other than Founder McNallen's and Edward Thorson's works, I'm not so sure I've read one of these books, but I think that, like I was talking about, people sharing that they're Asatru with other people, any way that they can do that is good. So as far as, books where people are relaying their genuine experiences with Asatru, whether that's a story about something that happened to them, or an academic work where they're, relaying their insights and they add their personal experiences into that. It sounds good to me as far as what I think about them. I think I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but it sounds good to me, but that would depend on the specific book, I guess.
What Cliff said. Really and truly, yeah, it all depends on the author and whether their experience is an honest one, and whether the author is a worthy individual or a lunatic. I would love to hear or to read written accounts of people's experiences with the gods, assuming that I believe those people and they were people of merit that I trusted. The books that I can think of that match your description are written by mentally disturbed and disreputable people that I can think of, and I don't find value from their books that I've read on the subject. There may be a lot out there that I'm unfamiliar with and I'd love to know. But the ones I'm aware of are ones that I wouldn't put a lot of stock in and that I do find blasphemous. Okay, so Sir Omega, hello. I am a beginner at European pagan faith, and I want to know what I can give as an offering to Thor. Cliff.
Whatever you give, it needs to be genuine, and it needs to be something that both is meaningful to you and that you believe Thor would appreciate. It's easier when it comes to ancestors, especially ancestors that you had personal relationships with that were living, because you may know what type of beer that your grandpa liked, or you may know what kind of cake your grandma liked or something. And so those can be, fairly easy to know what's going to make grandpa or grandma happy. Well, I'll get them their favorite thing. But I think, if you're a craftsperson, anything that you put your time and energy into, given with the proper intent, is going to be a good offering. Ultimately, of course, it's Thor's determination as to whether that has worth or not. If you want to go based on our lore, I think that an alcoholic beverage such as ale or mead is a good choice. Certainly, some kind of a meat like salmon or ox or beef would be a good choice. Goat could be a good choice. I know at Thora something that we've done in the past in my family and in my kindred is to focus on goat themed meals, and that Thor gets a plate of that. So, goat cheese bread and goat cheese with, like, the blueberries or cranberries rolled on top of it, and some kind of a goat meat based entree like a stew or something like that. It's it's a bit gamey, so depending on your taste, it may be tricky to prepare in a way that pleases everybody. But knowing that there's the story of Thor sharing the meat from his goats with Thiafi and his family, seems like something that the intention, I think, would be recognized by Thor. But also, I guess if you are, this is a real much more niche thing, but if you are like an iron worker or something that you have made and struck with a hammer and fire would probably be a good choice. But most of us, I don't think, meet that criteria. But something that something that you've put your intent into is the most important part. I think that if it's a personal offering, something you've put your own time and energy and perhaps made with your own hands is a good choice. But something that you've purchased can be of equally good intent because you have put your labor into that. Giving it with good intent is I think the most important part. Determining what exactly that gift should be is really a much more personal choice from you.
When the gods are concerned, it's all the more true that it's the thought that counts. Thor doesn't need stuff. Like a lot of the time when we're considering giving a gift to a person that we know, we have to consider the utility of it, or like, is there something they need? Thor doesn't need from you. So it's all about the intention of what you're giving. And that said, I don't think it's a value thing, but I think it's an intention thing. So there's two routes you could go. And I think Cliff talked really good about the first one. So you can base it on stuff that you think Thor would like from the things that you know about Thor. Traditionally, Cliff mentioned, any of the things Cliff mentioned, absolutely. I think that, mead is kind of a go-to for all of the gods and goddesses in Asatru. It's just become a very customary thing that we do. But any alcoholic beverage, I think, is something that is a good option. I think that's a frequent thing folks do that's well received and well thought. The general thought is that Thor likes beer or ale, something that's stout. Again, that's what people, that's the impression that many of us have gotten over time. I think anything you want to offer that way is nice, and as long as it's done with the right intention, it's not a bad thing. But also, so there's the other thing to consider is what is meaningful for you to give. So if you brew your own mead or your own alcohol, or you make wine or whatever you make, that's special because it's a gift. It's special because of its relationship to you. If you have something that is a tradition in your family that's special to you or your kinfolk, and you offer that to Thor, it's special because it's something that's special to you and you're sharing that. So you can go with something you think you have reason to believe that Thor might like on his own, or something that's really special to you that you want to share with him. I think either way is a really good way to go. And the bigger thing is that you just get out there and do it. A lot of people with the best of intentions will hem and haw and not actually make the offering. So consider this might be your first offering to Thor, but it should by no means be your last offering to Thor. So think of something that you think is respectful, offer it in piety and with noble intentions, and that is good. And it is a step in the right direction. And I have every reason to believe that Asatru will accept it with the intent that you offer it. But I think that's admirable that that's something that you want to do. As a side note, and I've told the story on here a number of times, and I did this as a grown man, not very grown. I think I was like 20, but my first offering to Freya was in the lore. She likes gold, so I got Goldschlager shot, and she has cats that pull her chariot. So I had some fancy feast for her cats. That was, but again, I didn't know a lot. I used what I knew to try to do something nice. And I thought that was really meaningful. And I hope that it was. I feel that it was. And it loops back to that is the same day that I had the dream that involved Freya that I feel is particularly meaningful to me. So I think that from very, humble but well-intentioned results, or offerings, you can get really, really nice result, and some really special things can happen. It's not exactly the same in the Havamal. Odin talks about, with a half a cup and a half a loaf, he was able to make a friend. And I think that that's something to be said. You making an offering, even if it's a humble one, is a nice gesture, and that gesture is likely to be repaid in a special way for you.
Trying is so much better than not trying. The attempt at giving a gift of worth. I mean, think about it this way: our gods have been neglected by our folk for such a long time, that even I think even the attempt at giving something may have more value than some very costly offerings perhaps made by our ancestors when that was what was normal. And I don't mean to diminish the offerings that our ancestors gave, but clawing our way back to the Aesir, I think, is a gift in and of itself that they would see with some worth, granting the fact that I don't know what they think or see.
So 100%, we live in a time that is very special in that way. I mentioned earlier that our values matter much more when there's consequence. When everyone's Asatru, and that's the culture you're in, your being Asatru is right and good, and you should do it. But there's something more and an extra layer of value when most people aren't Asatru, and you are coming from not being Asatru to restoring your family to troth with the Aesir. That's a bigger deal. And this is another point to the question we had a few questions ago about experiential versus scholasticism when it comes to practicing our faith. When you do what Cliff just did, that's living Asatru. When you consider our gods as living beings with thoughts, with feelings, and with agency, and you phrase things that way, and you contemplate your relation to them and your offerings and your behavior in a sense of, well, what do I think the gods would think about this? And that's never going to be perfect. So, no impiety intended. None of us know the mind of our gods to a complete degree. But the best that we owe them is to, or the least that we owe them is to employ our own empathy to try to envision them as the very best we can imagine of people and to treat them as at least that and treat them like living sentient beings and not like scholastic constructs. Our gods live and exist, and they see us and they know us, and us considering them and thinking of them in that very vital living way is a big part of doing this right. And this flows naturally into our next question. Do you believe the gods see into our hearts and hear our minds? I think keeping that in mind can help us to be noble, not only outwardly, but inwardly, noble in both thought and deed. Cliff, what say you?
So I will address the second part first. I agree absolutely that what we keep in our minds and what we feed our minds, as far as media that we consume, is very important to us being noble outwardly as well as inwardly. We very much we're energetic creatures, right? We can make things real in the world by our thoughts. The power of positive thinking. It's been called in like pop culture and like books for how to train salespeople and stuff like that, or books on how to be successful at dating or whatever have you. And there's a real element of truth to that. If you envision yourself in a better situation than you are, whatever that aspiration is, you can make that real, because it's motivating. And I think that there's a bit more than that going on there. I think that there's a real kind of magical energy, for lack of a better term, that goes on there, that we, can output energy that will draw us towards things or draw things towards us. And that can be good and bad. If you have a bad attitude, you tend to encounter bad situations. It's not foolproof either. There's other people with other energies out there and other entities with other energies that can totally affect us. So it's not like just thinking happy thoughts is going to, make you invulnerable and only good things will happen to you. But if you're a pessimist, I can pretty well guarantee that bad things are going to happen to you all the time, because you won't even recognize the good ones when they do. And on top of that, I really do believe, and I don't follow what I'm about to say here perfectly. I don't think anyone does, but what we put into our minds very much matters. And I'll probably make some people angry when I say this, because, it's not things that we like to think about, but, I think that things that we consume in pop culture, in movies and in music, often have a very negative effect on the kind of people that we can be, that they affect our potential and that they affect the way that we see the world. Just for an old timers kind of example, School's Out for the Summer by Alice Cooper is a song about how basically it doesn't matter to learn, and that you should just go and do whatever. And, it may seem like a fun song on the surface level, but if you realize that that's telling, young people, or it did tell young people a long time ago who are now older than me, about, why it's good to be dumb and a bum, that's not really something that you should be feeding your mind, and certainly not feeding your soul. And, the same thing can be said about, movies that glorify, like wanton violence. I'm not talking about, a movie about battle necessarily, but all the, the murder porn out there, not to mention regular old porn. These are not things that are healthy. So keeping our minds strong and filling them with things that will make us stronger and better is absolutely important. And will help us be noble both inside, which I think is a prerequisite. We have to be noble inside before we can be noble outside, because if it's a false outward nobility, it's not really nobility at all. You're doing something different than it's fake. Now, as far as whether or not I believe the gods see into our hearts and hear our minds, they are divine, so I don't doubt that they could do such a thing, but I don't believe they often do. I don't even believe that they know all of our names, because we're not all that important. Some of us are, and I don't mean me. I just mean that some people are important because they've made themselves important. They have caught the attention of the gods by doing worthy things. I would hope that I'm one of them, but that's not something I can determine. What I need to do is to keep trying to be one of those worthy people. So I think that, if Odin wanted to send Hugin and Munin out and for them to bring back reports about what Clifford has done today, he certainly could, and he would get that information. I just don't think that's probably something that that he's likely to do. But maybe, could, yes, do, probably not.
So that's interesting, following Cliff on that. So first, I can say confidently that our gods know your name, Cliff. Secondly, I agree that they have better things to do, and we don't have any reason to believe that they like creep around in your thoughts and your stuff. Again, as Cliff said, they are gods, they are mighty. I do not for a second think that they could not have such knowledge if they wanted it. But I don't think that's how they operate. And we don't have the same built in within Asatru that they do in some other faiths, to where our gods are looking to condemn you for microaggression things. But like Cliff said, what you consume and what you spend your time thinking on directly affects the things you manifest in your life and the way you conceive of the world. So certainly, the more we can, when we have thoughts that are unworthy, the more we can adjust when we make note of them and make the effort to think worthy thoughts or to bring unworthy thoughts in line with worthiness. That process in and of itself is instructive and helpful for us to become better people. But here is the caveat and the thing that came to mind when you asked the question. I think that they certainly do both of those things when invited to. So when we communicate with the gods, I don't think that they have a language preference. I think they speak whatever language your soul is speaking. I think they speak intent. When I give bloat, I ask the gods to see into our hearts, to hear our words, to know our deeds, and to judge our worth. I invite them to do that as an open-handedness and as a bearing of truth. And I think when invited to do so, they're inclined to perhaps do so. So I think they have if the question is like, are they spying on us all the time? Probably not. I don't think. I don't think that's really their nature or something that they would lower themselves to really do. If the question is, do they know your intent when you go to the altar and you speak to them? Can they see through the either deception or just inadequacy of your language? Yes. Do they see into your heart and know what you mean, even if you don't have the right words? Yes, I think those things are true. So it's kind of a nuanced answer to the question. Question for both. I'm in the process of publishing a 9-song Asatru folk music album. If I emailed a song or two, would you give feedback on them? I'm looking forward to sharing with you. Just joined. First, welcome. I am excited that you joined. That's fantastic. And yes, I would love to hear the music that you made. I think it's amazing that you made music, and I would be glad to give you, my feedback on it. What about you, Cliff?
Yeah, welcome, first of all. And I would love to hear what you want to share with us. In fact, something that I think that we all can do better at Asatru is involving music in Asatru. It's something that I know we've wanted to do for a long time, but haven't, I don't think yet, been able to really successfully pull off. So anyway, I think, I mean, I don't know if this is your intention or not, if it's just for fun or just for nice, as the Pennsylvania Dutch say, that's great. But if there's, aspirations on, on more than that, we would love to have more music involved in Asatru at a ritual level as well. So please do share it. We'll give you any feedback that you want, and I'm excited to hear it.
Absolutely. All of that. So many times we know stuff we want, but knowing it and being able to produce it are two different things. We want a lot more Asatru art, and I mean that in all sense of the word. Certainly in visual arts, but in music, in poetry, in cinema, in sculpture, in any number of things. Sometimes it's a matter of waiting for the artist to come forward, and it's really cool that you want to do that. So it brings me to the last question we have for tonight. Question: I got dollar bills back in change that have triple numbers and sometimes quadruple. Could this be a sign? 999, for example. Where can one find number symbolism meanings that is Asatru, if there is such thing? Cliff, do you know about that?
Well, I talked about omens and signs a little bit earlier, and I think that part of how those operate is that you see them. Most people wouldn't see that there, I think. But if you do, and that has some meaning to you, then that is relevant to whether or not that is a sign or an omen. And it would only be for you in that case. It wouldn't necessarily be some universal truth, but it would be something that is informative to you. I mean, I think that there are, some numeral symbols in Asatru. 3 is the easiest one to think of. Triplicates and triples are very common, not only in Asatru, but in all Aryan religiosity. And then an extension of that is 9. It's a 333. There are others, but I know there's sources that are better than me as far as numerology and how that might be applicable to what you're looking for.
So I am not that guy. Cliff's first thing, could it be a sign to you? Yes, if that is a language that you speak and there is, perhaps there is something meaningful to it. I don't discount that for a second. numerology or number stuff has never been something that has spoken to me particularly. But a source that I would encourage you to get, I know Edred Thorson has written about numeric correspondences and runic numerology. I think that he has written that in a number of places. I know for a fact he talks about that in Rune Lore. So, Rune Lore by Edred Thorson, I think, is a good source for you to check out if it's something that you find interesting. Thank you guys so much. I think this has been a good discussion this evening. We've had a lot of really good questions, and I appreciate you guys. I appreciate those of you that donated. Thank you for being generous. And I appreciate the guys that show up and ask questions and our new people that decided to join us on the broadcast. And especially thank you, Cliff, for joining us and talking about something that I think is extremely important for all of us. So thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. And thank you to my modem for not blowing up today.
There you have it. All right. Well, Cliff, I will see you next week at Ostara. Folks here, I hope I will see you next week at Ostara too, if you're able to make it. And wherever you find yourself, your local Hof is celebrating Ostara this weekend. If it's not Thor's Hof, because we'll see you next weekend. So if you are near Baldershof, near Odenshof, or near Jordshof in White Springs, Florida, Odenshof in Brownsville, California, or Baldershof in Murdoch, Minnesota. Or if you can get there in the next few days, each of those Hofs on Saturday will be celebrating Ostara, and we would love to have you join us at any of our Hofs and get involved and participate. Thank you guys all for making the time this evening. It's been great talking to you. Till next time, hail the Aesir, hail the Folk, hail the AFA, and remember, victory never sleeps.